What's going on, guys? Derek here from No BS Auto Rehab. So today I've got my uncle's 2013 Volkswagen CC, and we've been driving this thing around. He's been hearing a grinding noise coming out of the front end of it, and he wasn't sure if it was the tires or one of the hub assemblies going bad. So I took it on a test drive, swerved it back and forth, and I'm pretty confident it's the right front hub assembly. So I would show you how to diagnose a hub assembly, how to tell if you can feel it bumping or anything whenever you're wiggling it. But this one I think is in the early stages. It's just making noise. A lot of hub assemblies, they'll make noise before they actually fail. A lot of the times the seals will go bad, they'll get dirt inside of them. They'll start grinding away at the bearing, and then eventually it'll completely fail, where then you get the wobbling in the front end of the suspension. But I'm gonna go ahead and start tearing this thing apart, give you guys a how-to on how to replace the hub assembly on this thing. And it is super hot. So you can see me sweating right here. It's like 95 degrees here in North Carolina right now. So if you see me sweating, sorry, I'm just trying to get the job done. And with that, we'll get to the video. So if you've never worked on a Volkswagen before, the first thing you'll notice is these little wheel lug nut covers. They're real aggravating to get off if you don't know how to do it. But the best way to do it is just get a 90-degree angle pick. You can put it in the center of the hole and just pull it out. So that's the simplest, easiest way to get those things off without breaking them. I've seen some people will take a flathead screwdriver and jam it down inside of it, but what that ends up doing is cracking the cover, and eventually they'll go bad and end up falling off. But once you get those covers off, then you can get to the lug nuts and get the wheel off. Alright, so we're going to jump right on into the how-to. So I tried to condense all my footage down as much as possible, so the video, I got it as short as I could with still keeping all of the content that I needed in the video to show you exactly step by step on how to get this job done. So what you can see me doing right here, the best way whenever you're taking your brakes apart and you don't want to have to take the caliper completely apart, put a screwdriver in there between the fins and the rotor. You can pry back a little bit, and that'll actually take the pressure off those brake pads so that you can just pull the caliper completely off. What you see me doing here is now taking the caliper bracket bolts off of the back of the steering knuckle. Now what I didn't realize on this Volkswagen was just how tight all these bolts were going to be. I don't think I've ever worked on a vehicle that I've had so much trouble just breaking nuts and bolts loose to get stuff off. But what I ended up having to do is use my 1/2-inch Milwaukee impact gun, and of course I'll have links in the description for some of the tools and stuff that I used in the video. But that's what I had to use to break that thing loose. If you were up on a lift or had it a little bit higher where you could get a creeper underneath it, you might could get a super long breaker bar on it to break those bolts loose and get everything off. But once you get the bolts out, lift the caliper up, and the same way with any vehicle, make sure you don't dangle that caliper by the brake line. It ends up ruining the rubber line. They're not made to stretch, and eventually that rubber, the rubber inside of the line will collapse, and it'll cause your caliper to get stuck. It's going to wear out your brakes, heat up everything to where you're going to have to spend a lot more money fixing it than what you're already spending on it. So in the rotor there is a small little Torx screw. You'll have to unscrew that. If you don't have like an impact driver, they can be kind of tough to get out sometimes. But what I do with these Volkswagens is I will put one lug back in it just to hold the rotor while you're tapping on it to get it to break loose. Just make sure you don't ever hit the surface of where the brakes actually touch on the rotor. If you hit that, then you're going to have a knot in the rotor. It could cause it to warp, and going down the road you'll be able to feel it bumping like crazy. So what I just removed there was the 24mm bolt that goes into the axle, which holds it into the hub assembly. What you will need is a 12.24mm socket. If you don't have one, go ahead and get one. Again, the link will be in the description for that as well. But the next step is to remove the lower control arm nuts so that you will be able to push that lower control arm off of the ball joint and get it out of the way of the axle. A lot of American cars, you don't have to do this step. The hub assemblies only use 3 bolts on a lot of the American vehicles, so you don't have to actually move the axle out of the way to get to anything. But of course, with Volkswagen being a good old German vehicle that they are, you have to take a few more bolts apart, which it wasn't too bad. You can see right here what I'm doing is just pulling the axle back out of the hub assembly so that I can slide it out of the way in order to get to the bolts. So just push down on that arm, get everything broke loose. You'll have to wiggle the axle a little bit, but once the splines come out, you'll be perfectly fine. Now, what I'm using here on the back is a long breaker bar. instead of it being a regular like 13 or 15 millimeter socket like most cars, of course Volkswagen had to be difficult and they put a T55 Torx bit on the back of the hub assembly. Luckily these things weren't super tight, because with Torx bits, if you've never used them before, they are really easy to strip out. So before you start putting a lot of pressure on that ratchet, make sure you have the bit all the way in into the bolt. Make sure it's not going to strip out when you start putting pressure on it. If you bust your knuckles on the concrete, you probably wouldn't be very happy anyway. But what I like to do here is just get everything broke loose. And once everything's broke loose, I will go back around with my electric stuff, just for the simple fact that I don't want to break my tools in the middle of the job and be stuck trying to drive somewhere to get stuff. So it's a lot easier just to go ahead and break everything loose, and then right here you'll see me pull out the electric stuff to go ahead and finish taking it apart. You know, sometime if I had a socket, I probably would have broke out the electric impact to start with, because I wouldn't be scared it was going to strip out or break or something crazy like that. And then the same reason, the bolts have been so tight on this car. I mean, it's kind of insane how tight everything was. There wasn't Loctite on anything. I don't know if it was that way from the factory, but everything was super tight. Alright, so what you just saw there was exactly how you get hub assemblies off. If they are bolt-on hub assemblies, you can get them off. Just hit them. It does take a while. I probably beat on that thing for a solid 15 or 20 minutes before I got it to break all the way loose. But what you saw me do there was get out a wire brush and put it on the end of my drill, because that assembly was corroded like crazy to the steering knuckle. I'm not really sure why it was so corroded. It's only a 2013, so you wouldn't think that something like that would be so rusty, but that's why I had so much trouble getting that thing off. And again, watch your toes. Make sure you're wearing shoes when you do these jobs, because you definitely don't want to be hobbling around your house after you got done working on somebody else's car. So right here, what I did is you have to wiggle the hub assembly back around a little bit, get the bolts started, and then go back around with your ratchet and tighten them back up. I like to make sure that any bolts that I tighten up, I do manually. I don't like to tighten stuff down and leave it with the electric ratchet, because you never know, even though it sounds like it's getting tight, you never know if there's something inside that tool that could be going bad and creating a problem. So once you get all those bolts completely tight, the next thing is just going to be get those 3 bolts for the lower ball joint back in place. Finally. I don't know if you can see the sweat dripping from my face. Now I just got to wiggle it around, get those bolts to fall through without coming back out. We're almost there. So one thing I cut out of the video to make it a little bit shorter was how long it took me to wrestle these bolts back into the bolt holes. I think I had about 40 minutes worth of video showing me try to just get those bolts lined back up to get in the arm. An easier way to line that thing up would be to loosen the bolts that are actually holding the control arm in place, but I don't like doing that just because I didn't have a lift. I wouldn't have been able to put pressure on the suspension components before I tighten those bushings back down in the arm. And whenever you do that, you never want to tighten stuff up without weight on the vehicle. So like right now while it's hanging down. But either way, if you fight with it for a little bit, you can get it back in place. It is kind of difficult, but it's not too bad. So after that, you'll go ahead and get the 3 nuts tightened back up on the lower control arm. Make sure you put some red Loctite back on that axle bolt. That is one of the most important bolts on the vehicle. Go ahead and tighten that thing up. And you can look up the torque spec online. It's probably around 180 to 200 foot-pounds. Most of the time though, with those hub assemblies and you're tightening the axle down, just get it really tight. I know a lot of people, if you have just a basic 1/2 inch torque wrench, it probably only goes up to 150 pounds. I don't have one that goes any higher than that, but I also know that 1/2 inch Milwaukee gun does get a lot tighter than 150 foot-pounds. So once you get all that tightened down and you feel good about it, go ahead and put your rotor back on, put the little torque screw back in it, and then all you have to do is slide your caliper back on. So that's why it's really important at the beginning of the job to go ahead and spread those brake pads out a little bit so that you know it's going to slide easily right back over the rotor, and you're not going to have to fight it later on while you're trying to finish everything up. So right here again, I'll tighten them up with the ratchet, the electric ratchet, and then I'll come back with the manual ratchet just to make sure I got all the bolts completely tight the way they need to be before I would get the car back on the road. Once you get that brake caliper bracket back on, you know you're completely done with the job. That was all the steps involved in doing it. The main thing is just don't get discouraged whenever you have a little trouble. A, getting the hub assembly off the steering knuckle, and then B, when you're trying to get those 3 bolt holes, or the 3 bolts to line up with the holes on the lower control arm. Once you get all that stuff done, the job itself is pretty easy. Just a few nuts and bolts to take it apart. It's pretty straightforward, and hopefully with this video you'll be able to do it really easily and be able to get your car back on the road and driving quietly and more solid, so you won't be able to hear any kind of crazy noises while you're driving. So again, right here, just go ahead and tighten up your lug nuts. Not too tight because you want to go back and torque them. One thing is just make sure all the lug nuts are the same torque spec, because as your rotors heat up and cool down, there is a potential to warp your rotors. Alright guys, so there you have it. That is how you replace the hub assembly on a 2013 Volkswagen CC. I will put all the years of the cars that it matches. There's probably a few that I'm not going to get, but I'm pretty sure it works on some Passats and the CC. They probably share some of the same parts. But the only tool that I think you might have to buy if you don't have it is a 12.25 millimeter socket for the axle bolt. As long as you have that, you'll be able to get this job easily. And also a good set of Torx bits. If you don't have a good T55, there's a good possibility you might break it on the bolts that actually hold the hub assembly in. So as long as you have that stuff, you're in good shape to get that job done. So my uncle just came, picked up the car. We drove it around the block a few times. Definitely got rid of the noise that he was hearing. And the hub assembly that we pulled off is in fact bad. I'll try to get it right here where you can see it. So you can see right there, this thing was super rusty. The car is not old, and it really surprises me that there's that much corrosion on this thing. But you can see right here, the lip right there, that seal is actually supposed to be flat with the bottom of the assembly. So what happened is probably dirt, some of that rust got down inside the assembly, caused it to make a grinding noise, and that was starting the process of this thing going bad. So they don't always show signs of them going bad. Whenever you're shaking the wheel like you normally would to check a hub assembly, sometimes they just make a lot of noise and then eventually they just go completely bad. They start wobbling, or there is the possibility that that thing could lock up on you on the road. So that's why it's super important whenever you hear a noise, don't just ignore it. Make sure you fix it and then get your car checked out. So whenever you finish, again, make sure you have your alignment checked. Doing something like that probably won't throw it out, but it never hurts to have it checked anytime you do any steering component like that, especially if we took the ball joint apart, put it back together. So there's a chance it could have moved the alignment just a little bit. So once you have all that done, you're good to go. Your car is going to be in a lot better shape. I hope you guys enjoyed this how-to. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.